This is Audible.
Carcharodons, Red Tithe, by Robbie McNiven. Read by Shogo Miyakita. They were dispatched into the outer darkness upon that first day of exile, there to ravage the foes of mankind until their final atonement. Their forgotten one gave them remit unbound, to set about the traitor, the alien, and the renegade without mercy, and to harrow them in their places of strength. So began their long hunt. They hunt still. Chapter 17, paragraph 98. The Mythos Angelica Mortis, circa M36. File log Omicron. Vermilion-level access code input required. Access granted. Welcome. Interrogator Nzogwu. Initiating data scan. Data scan complete. Transferring selected file 2873. File transferred. Subject header. Gorgas Waypoint Station check log. Dated 455-0875.M41. Beginning Vox transcript. This is Captain Wilhelm van Hoyt of the penal ship Imperial Truth, reporting en route to Zartak Primary Penitentiary via Fallowrain. We are code Viridis. All systems are secure at this time. Empyrean navigation has progressed exceedingly well since passing the straits Corward of Star Shoal. My navigator reports we may reach Zartak up to a week in advance of our projected in-system arrival date. We are preparing for warp jump within the hour. I intend to take full advantage of these karma currents while I can. Zartak is not a place I would wish to find myself stranded for any length of time. I commend my ship and my crew to the guiding light of the God Emperor. This is Captain Wilhelm van Hoyt, signing out. Vox transcript ends. File deletion initiated. Logging out. Thought for the day. He is our light in the dark, our sword in the night. Chapter 1. The screaming marked an end to the day's toil. The aching noise came from the gargoyle-moored klaxons that lined each of the narrow walls, tunnels, subsurface lines, and assembly points of Zartak's vast mine works. Mika Doran Skell dropped his half-pick into its tool crate, his scrawny limbs trembling with exhaustion. His fingers ached as he uncurled them. The blisters had burst again, and blood was welling up in little oozing patches to discolor the thick layer of dust coating his hands. "Move, inmate!" barked the arbitrator, overseeing equipment reclamation. The armor-plated lawman gestured with the barrel of his heavy combat shotgun, motioning him back into line. Skell bowed his head and fell in behind Nedzi and the others, dropping his magnicalled hands. The explosive primed bonds chafed at his wrists, a constant aching reminder of 5 months of captivity. 5 months since the cowardly gang boss Roax had ratted him out. 5 months since he had arrived on the subterranean hell of Zartak. "Argrim's here," muttered Dolar, as he dropped into line behind Skell. The presence of his big cellmate at his back was reassuring. Without him, Skell would have died at least twice already, either in the burrow pits and excavation lanes, or trudging back to the prison cells of Sink Shaft 1. He had repaid his cellmate many times over. A sudden pain pressed against Skell's temples, as though the atmosphere in the low rock tunnel had suddenly changed. None of the other inmates showed any signs of discomfort. Skell's bloody hands clenched into fists. "Argrim's going to try something," he muttered to Dolar. "You sure?" "Yeah, I can feel it." Dolar said nothing, but Skell sensed him draw fractionally closer. The line ahead was beginning to divide, as ragged prison groups were pulled from their column by shouting overseers and herded down the passages that would lead them back to their cell blocks and hanging cages. The pressure in Skell's head increased. Argrim and his cronies would strike soon, once the mass of dirt-caked, dull-eyed laborers had been separated and divided. They'd tried it before, and Skell knew they'd try it again. They hated him. Not because he was from the sump hive of Fallowrain, not because he was one of Roax's old gang, not even because he refused to bend before Argrim's reputation and authority. They hated Skell because he was a witch. That concludes the session review, said Warden Primary Schultz. Are there any questions? Sub-Warden Rannick? The words dragged Rannick from the fug of boredom that had gripped her thoughts for the past 2 hours. The Situation Room was silent, the picked screen behind the warden's lectern blinking, the lumen strips still dimmed. The transcription servitor in the corner clattered to a halt as its autoquill finished taking minutes. The other sub-wardens were all staring at her. No questions, sir, Rannick said. A thoroughly comprehensive review, as ever. Was it indeed? Asked Schultz from his perch behind the Aquila-stamped lectern. The man's stony glare was as hard as the blunt-force sarcasm he so loved to inflict on new officers. What a relief to have met with your approval. I shall be sure to tell Judge Simmons of your weighty opinion next time we share a hollow briefing. The 13 other Adeptus Arbites sub-wardens didn't respond, but Rannick could sense their amusement. It made her bristle. She fought down her anger, channeling it into a deferential nod. Perhaps, the grizzled warden continued, you could elucidate further upon the last point I raised. The last point, sir, Rannick repeated. Yes, sub-warden. The one discussed barely a minute ago. Rannick said nothing. The silence in the Situation Room stretched to a painful, unnatural length. Finally, a bang at the hatch door broke it. Not now, Schultz snarled, his gaze not leaving Rannick. The banging sounded again. Scowling, the warden deactivated the lock with a flick of his sensor wand. The hatch slid open, and a youth in the pale grey uniform of the Precinct Fortress's Augur Division ducked inside. What? The Warden Primary snapped. The boy threw a hurried salute. Word from Augur Chief Tal, sir. The sensor relays just chimed. The Augur outposts on the system's trailward edge have detected a lone vessel breaking into real space. Identity? We're still running verification, sir, but initial scans of its keel tag and ident codes show it's probably our latest shipment. The Imperial Truth? Schultz demanded. That would make it over a week early. Yes, sir. That's what Chief Tal said. We have tried to hail it, but we aren't receiving any response. Communications may just be choppy due to interference from the asteroid belt, but they're definitely registering our messages. How far out is she? Just entering the belt, sir. Once she navigates it, she'll be 3 hours from high anchor. Gentlemen, we have a situation, Schultz said to the assembled subwardens. This session is formally adjourned. Come with me. Schultz left the Situation Room. The subwardens filed out from behind their benches and swept after him in a buzz of sudden, nervous excitement. Bit of good fortune, this, Subwarden Clan muttered as they entered the corridor, just loud enough for Rannick to hear. The chief had her cold back there. She's still making the same old mistakes. Rannick forced herself not to respond. She could feel the scorn of the other arbitrators as they clattered along the Precinct Fortress's darkened rockcrete tunnels, following in the Warden Primary's footsteps. None of them thought she was fit to oversee her own sub-precinct, regardless of her exceptional progenium training and indoctrination statistics, or the fact that she'd finished top of her class at the Schola Exubitos on Terrax. In their eyes, in the 5 Terran months since Rannick had arrived, she'd done nothing to prove she was worthy of holding the same rank as them. She would prove them wrong. The Warden Primary burst into the precinct's centrum dominus, buried deep within the fortress's armored depths. There was a scrape of chairs and a thud of combat boots as the 2-tiered room came to attention, cogitators and scanner systems still humming. Report, Schultz snapped. Chief Tal strode across from his station at the auger arrays, a yellow message chit in hand. It's definitely the Imperial Truth, sir, he said, giving the ident readout to the warden. Almost 7 days ahead of schedule, and breaking from the warp in completely the wrong place. Comms? Schultz asked, looking up at the Voxbanks ringing the Centrum's gantries. We caught a burst of transmission code less than 60 seconds ago, sir, said a ruddy-faced Vox lieutenant, earphones in hand. Unintelligible. There's been nothing since. The contact is just clearing the asteroid belt now, so the signal should become stronger. We're keeping all channels open. Subwarden Rannick, Schultz said, turning to the officers who'd followed him into the cogitator-ringed pit at the heart of the Centrum. Operations Manual 17, Chapter 1, Paragraph 1. What is the foremost rule when faced with the unknown or the uncertain? Prepare for the worst, Rannick said. And trust in the God Emperor, sir. The warden nodded. There, you see? Even the bluntest blades have some cut if you sharpen them enough. We are arbitrators. We always assume the worst. Master-at-Arms. He gestured at Macran, the head of Zartak's combat division. The big woman, her shaved skull twisted with old flamer burns, came to attention with a clatter of flak plate. Warden Primary, issue a priority broadcast throughout the fortress and to all sub-precincts across the planet. Code Red. Effective immediate. Stand to. Blood was dripping onto the floor slowly. Dolar hadn't noticed. "Dolar," Skell said. The older convict started, looking down at him with wide, worried eyes. "Your nose," Skell said, holding out a rag ripped from the hem of his grubby penal fatigues. Dolar stared at it, uncomprehending. Skell wondered if he was concussed. "Never mind," he said after a moment, stuffing the rag back into his pocket. Dolar's eyes became vacant again as he leaned forwards over the edge of his shackle bunk. Blood continued to fall, drip by drip. Skell rolled back onto his own bunk and grimaced. Around them, the sounds of the prison intruded, drifting up through the cell's mesh flooring and around the bars of the hatch window. Raised voices, the slamming of doors, the buzz of active alarm systems and pig monitors, thudding boots, and the rattle of magnicals. Skell had only been here 5 months, and he already wished he was dead. At least then he wouldn't have to dig and grub with his numb, bleeding hands anymore. The requirements of the hundreds of mine works branching out from Sink Shaft 1 were without end. When prospectors had discovered that Zartak possessed a rich strata of raw adamantium-based minerals, the nearest consortium of hive worlds had acted quickly to forge a pact with the Adeptus Arbites, one that both relieved them of a good deal of their criminal underhive and enabled the tithing grade of the new mining colony to triple, much to the delight of the subsector's administratum officios. At some point, the original miner colonists had vanished and been replaced by the lowest Savlar, dregs, scum, and the plain unlucky, of half a dozen miserable industrialized Ethica subsector planets like Fallorain or Nilrest. That was why Skell and tens of thousands of convicts like him were on Zartak, to drag raw material for the Imperium starships and armies from the hard, black earth. Dolar had finally noticed his nosebleed and was ineffectually trying to stymie it with his grime-caked fingers. He was 2 years older than Skell, 16, Terran standard, or so he claimed. Yet most of the time, he acted no more coherently than a 10-year-old. Only his solid build and his willingness to resort to his fists had kept him alive so far. That, and his partnership with Skell. "Something's coming," Skell said, looking at the darkness beyond the hatch window. "Argrim again?" Dolar asked vacantly. Skell shook his head. "Something worse. It wasn't him I felt earlier." The pressure from the mine tunnel was still there, like a dull, ever-present headache, pulsing incessantly in his temples. He'd never felt it so strongly before. "Is it the things you see in the dark?" Dolar asked. "The things that keep giving you nightmares?" "They aren't nightmares," Skell said, scowling. "They're just... I don't know what they are." "Nothing good," Dolar mumbled. "Well, they can't be worse than this place," Skell replied. He was speaking lightly, but in truth, he was afraid. The things he had started seeing in his dreams recently, claws and talons spun from shadows, the crackle of lightning and bitter red eyes, had not brought him any comfort. Worst of all had been the face. It was a skull, a death mask, leering from a void of black. Whenever he saw it, it drew closer, grinning with savage, unblinking intensity. "They're coming for me," Skell said, still gazing at the barred entrance to the cell. "Not me?" Dolar asked. Skell shot him a look. "All of us." Dolar nodded. He always paid attention when Skell talked about the future. Theirs was a mutually beneficial partnership. The larger, older inmate protected the smaller physically, while the smaller guided the larger. Even for someone as slow as he was, Dolar had realized within weeks of their incarceration on Zartak that Skell had a special talent. It was the same talent that had made him such a lucky charm with the older gangmates back in the sump sink of Fallorain's planetary capital, Vorhive, at least before Roax had ratted him out. It was the same talent that always earned him such regular beatings from superstitious inmates like Argrim, whenever the arbitrators were looking the other way. Skell had the sight. Nosebleeds, headaches, nightmares. Few appreciated it. "We need to be ready," Skell said. "It'll start soon." His body still ached from Argrim's last attempted murder. The ambush had been sprung just as he'd predicted, when the work gang had been returning from Lower 616 at the end of the day's cycle's labor shift. Argrim, the big, brutal ex-smuggler from Chantry, would have staved his skull in with a concealed pick haft if Dolar hadn't put him down before he could get swinging. Then the arbitrators had arrived. Shock mauls buzzing. Dolar and Skell were still on their feet while their 3 attackers most definitely weren't, all thanks to Skell's foresight. The arbitrators had beaten them all the same. "When are they coming?" Dolar asked, casting a lingering glance at the cell hatch. Skell didn't answer. He didn't need to. An ear-splitting wail made Dolar start, the manacles binding him to his upper bunk clattering against its metal sides. The red emergency lumen over the Aquila-stamped hatch bathed the small, dank space in angry light. There was a jarring thud as secondary blast doors throughout the honeycomb structure of Sinkshaft 1's prison complex thumped shut on auto hinges. Dolar stared down at Skell. As the sound of heavy boots thumping past reached him over the screaming of the alarms, Skell swallowed and nodded. He shouted up to Dolar. "It started!" The Centrum Dominus was buzzing with activity. Operators clattering in their rune banks as they sought to update the data streaming in from the augers. In the tunnels outside, containment squads could be heard running past from the armories. Schultz was reviewing squad dispositions throughout the sub-precincts via the Centrum Dominus holochart. Rannick and the other officers still clustered around him. A shout from Vox Chief Hestel, seated on the upper communications gantry, disturbed the warden's assessments. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the Imperial Truth. She's just cleared the asteroid belts," Tal added from his station at the auger array. "Put it on Vox," Schultz ordered, gripping the brass railing running around the holochart. The room went suddenly quiet. There was a rush of static interference, rising and then dipping from an eerie squeal to a low grumble. Hestel bent over a frequency module, working a pair of sliders. A voice came and went, like a passing phantom. Eventually, it snapped into focus. "Repeat! This is Captain Van Hoyt of the Imperial Truth to anyone who can hear me. We are Code Black." "Captain," the Warden Primary called out. "We read you. This is Zartak Arbitrator Precinct Fortress Alpha. Warden Primary Schultz speaking. What is your status? Over." "Thank the God, Emperor," the voice of Van Hoyt crackled back. "We have a situation here, Warden Primary. Multiple prisoner exfiltration attempts. A heavy security breach. I've been forced to seal off vital decks and open the airlocks. I am currently barricading the bridge alongside the remains of my security detail." "Is First Arbitrator Nethim there?" the Warden Primary demanded. "Negative. He's currently holding out in the Enginarium. We have locked our course to Zartak's high orbit. Emperor willing, we can keep the scum at bay long enough to reach you." "Stand by, Captain," the Warden Primary said, signaling to Hestel to pause the connection. "McCran, are the sub-precincts mobilized?" "I estimate 85% readiness, sir, but my shock troop squads can deploy immediately." "Tal, how long do we have?" "Going off the Imperial Truth's current course," the Augur Chief said, bending over his screens, "and assuming Nethim manages to hold the Enginarium, she'll achieve high anchor in a little over 2 hours." "Sir, should I forward a message to the Chorustorium?" asked Hestel. "Negative. There's no need to tax the astropaths just yet. The situation is still developing. McCran, take your teams into the void via the Divine Retribution, intercept the Imperial Truth, and contain the insurrection. I will continue to communicate with Van Hoyt while you are in transit, and pass relevant intelligence on to you. After the suppression has been carried out, and the situation is stable, I will deploy detachments from the sub-precincts to support the cleanup operation. Use extreme prejudice." "Of course, sir," McCran replied. "Warden Primary, I have a request," Rannick said from among the assembled sub-wardens. Schultz scowled. "What is it?" "Let me go with the shock squads. I can provide liaison between you and McCran, subordinate to her orders, of course." Rannick inclined her head towards the Master-at-Arms. She crossed her arms over her breastplate and glared back. "What makes you imagine she'd need you as an intermediary, Rannick?" the Warden Primary demanded. "McCran is a veteran of 12 Code Black insurrections and a master suppressor. She is more than capable of heading up the operation and maintaining contact with the Centrum Dominus at the same time." "If I may speak plainly, sir," Rannick said, taking a breath, "I want to be with the shock squads because I want to prove I'm capable. I understand my status as the youngest sub-warden in this room. Progenium training modules can only account for so much. I wish to show my devotion to the God Emperor and the Lex Imperialis in the fires of an active suppression." "You are impertinent, Rannick," the Warden Primary growled. "The Adeptus Arbites does not operate on such vain whims. You will be assigned to tasks I deem you worthy of. McCran will have enough to think about on board that ship without your inexperience getting in her way." "With respect, Warden Primary," Sub-Warden Clan cut in, "maybe it would be good to bloody her. This incident aboard the Imperial Truth should not be difficult to contain, and if we were to experience a security breach down here on the surface, I'd rather know all my fellow arbitrators have first-hand combat experience. One compromised sub-precinct can have dire consequences for the safety of all our facilities on Zartak." "Let me prove myself," Rannick added. "The Progenium thought I was ready enough to assign me here. The bowels of an Imperial prison hulk are nothing like the simulation exercises, Macran snapped, the faint red glow of the holochart giving her grizzled features a bloody hue. Which is precisely why she needs to experience it, Clem said. Sir, called Hestor from the Vox banks, transmission horn in hand. Captain Van Hoyt is still on Vox. I believe the prisoners are attempting to storm the bridge. We don't have time for this foolishness, growled Schultz. Macran, I leave Sub-Warden Rannick's assignment up to you. Just intercept that ship before it reaches high anchor. Rannick looked at Macran. The flame-scarred arbitrator glanced from the Warden Primary to Sub-Warden Clen, then finally nodded at Rannick. Draw shock kit from the armory. Shuttle Bay 14, 10 minutes. If you're not there, we're leaving without you. The fore armory of the White Moor, like every level above the slave decks, was almost completely silent. The only noise was the throbbing heartbeat of the warp drives, which shuddered up through the decking plates. The air was alive with the static charge of the active Gellerfield, the chlorine tang of ozone warring with the familiar sense of bolter oils and preservation unguents. Bail Shah, Reaper Prime, and Company Master passed noiselessly down the length of the armory hall, his bare feet making no sound on the cold metal deck. The few artisan serfs and repair savants still at work in the depths of the ship's night cycle bowed as he passed, their gaze averted. Shah ignored them, his void-black eyes focused instead on the objects the malnourished humans were attending. He passed row after row of empty battlesuits, ranked either side down the armory's long walls, every one mounted on a steel pedestal brace. Each set of power armor was different, each an amalgamation of patterns and designs. Many of them were ancient. The most common parts were from Mark V's, their surfaces studded with the gleaming brass orbs of the molecular bonding pins that held the worn plates of plasteel and ceramite together. Some bore the hook-nosed helmets of Mark VI's, others the ancient circular ceramite banding of Mark II's, or the vertical faceplate slits and horizontal monolens of the Mark III great helms. Only two features united the antique collection. All were painted with the same shade of deep grey, and all bore the same crest upon their right pauldrons, a white shark motif, jaw curling towards tail fin, to form a razor-toothed crescent set upon a void of black. Despite the efforts of the repair savants, the majority of the suits were still visibly scarred, not only with the ancient swirling honor patterns of exile markings, but with the blows of desperate, bloody, and all too recent battle. The artisans that labored in the ship's fore and aft armories had been working for almost a month, Terran standard, to repair the damage done by the Great Devourer. Still, Shah saw the gleam of bare metal as he passed, noting where armor had been raked and scored by chitin talons and blades, or pitted by bioacids and burrower beetles. The toll the war in the deeps had taken upon the chapter's venerable equipment had been high. The toll on the flesh of its warriors had been even higher. Shah himself walked with a slight limp, the pale grey skin of his right leg still not fully recovered from a gene stealer's claws. He had refused the offer of an augmetic. The wound was bearable, and, Voidfather knew, high-functioning bionics were in scarce enough supply as it was. He'd ordered Apothecary Tammer to save the replacement for a Void Brother who needed it. The Reaper Prime reached the end of the hall. Before him, mounted upon the naked rivets and bare steel of the high wall, hung the faded remnants of the war banner of the 3rd Battle Company. His company now, Shah reminded himself. Like the armor of the warriors that had fought to defend it, the heavy cloth bore fresh scars. Unlike the armor, the damage would remain unpatched, a ragged testimony to the fallen. Only the company's crest, the intertwining shark and scythe symbol mirroring the fresh tattoo on Shah's left temple, would be woven anew in white. The new honor scroll pinned to the banner's ragged bottom looked fresh and out of place. The ink describing the battle company's actions during the war in the deeps was barely dry. Shah's gaze lowered to the object that had drawn him to the armory during the dead hours of fasting and cryo-meditation. It was another suit of power armor, its hard plates the opposite of the plain white robe clothing Shah, standing rigid and inert on its pedestal like the other 86 suits lining the hall. This one, however, was different. Mostly Mark IV, its pauldron bandings were the color of bronze, and the exile honor markings inscribed upon its dark grey surface were more intricate. They covered the suit's gauntlets, vambraces, and greaves in whirling, interlocking designs, mirroring the tattoos on Shah's own pale forearms and legs. The breastplate bore in its center an embossed skull and twin lightning bolts, the crest of the ancient Terran Pacification War, the chapter's first battle honor. The helmet was also more elaborate. A heavy, modified Mark III Great Helm, the Vox uplink strip running along the top, had been fashioned into a high, jagged ceramite crest, while the visor plate around the Vox grille was painted with the likeness of a yawning white maw. The Third Company's shark and scythe sigil was inscribed over the helm's left temple. Shah felt his new tattoo, identical to the armor's marking, throb. The helm's inactive black lenses seemed to glare down at him in the armory's quiet, murky half-light. The looming suit had its gauntlets resting on the top of a great two-handed chain axe, the adamantium haft locked to the bottom of the plinth. The flared head of the weapon was uncased, the metal-tipped shark teeth that edged the bare rotor gleaming wickedly. Shah reached out and touched one jagged incisor. He half expected such a brazen violation to cause the inert figure to leap into motion. The weapon, like the armor, was what the chapter referred to as tapu. For someone of lower rank to lay even a finger upon it was anathema. But Shah was no longer of lower rank. The armor and the chain axe, Reaper, had belonged to Company Master Akia for as long as Shah could remember. He had been leading the Third Battle Company through the Outer Dark since Shah's days as a Voidborn initiate. Like many senior figures within the chapter, Akia had rarely been seen unarmored, even among his closest brethren. Shah himself hadn't witnessed him fully without battleplate until the day Apothecary Tama had pulled his dead white remains from its battered casing. Despite the ongoing repairs, the scars and rents of the Genestealer Broodlord's claws were still evident across the armor's grey surfaces. For 2.5 centuries, the suit had been Akia. Now it belonged to Shah. Even if tapu no longer applied to him, the thought of wearing it was an abomination. He withdrew his hand, gazing up into the eye lenses. He felt the soul of the dead company master glaring back. "He would not have approved." The voice startled Shah. He turned to find Te Kaharangi approaching. Although the chief librarian was fully armored, Shah only now heard the thump of footfalls and the whir of sound-deadened servos. Had it been anyone else, he would have worried at his own lack of vigilance. Te Kaharangi, however, had long ago established a habit of passing unnoticed. "You would not have approved of what, Venerable Chief Librarian?" Shah asked, as Te Kaharangi came to a halt beside him. The wizened psyker didn't look at him, but gazed up at Akia's old armor. Both Space Marines spoke in archaic High Gothic, the tongue used by their chapter since its inception so many millennia before. "The former company master would not have approved of you standing and staring at his battle plate during the dead hours, like some unbloodied initiate. If meditation or cryo-sleep do not suit you, then there is work to be done." Shah felt a stab of annoyance. He suppressed it. "I came to pay my respects." "There's been time enough for that. As Akia would have said, what's past has passed. You are our company master now. You must assume your full responsibilities." Shah looked at Te Kaharangi, the pale nomad, chief librarian of the chapter. His power armor was even more impressive than that of the company masters. Its underlying surface was a deep blue, and every inch of it, from the boots to the cable-studded psychic hood, was inscribed with a dense knotwork of swirling exile marks. A heavy set of scrimshawed shark teeth hung about his gauntlet, and more old charms dangled from his vambraces. In his right gauntlet, he grasped a forestaff of carved bone, the head fashioned into a maw clamped around a sea-green shard of stone. The rock gleamed in the dim light. "The tithing draws near," Te Kaharangi continued, turning to face Shah. "The tithing of a planet you once knew all too well. Are you ready, Reaper Prime?" "I am ready," Shah replied, forcefully, meeting the black void of Te Kaharangi's gaze. The face that framed the unnatural eyes was a disturbing mismatch of color. While much of it was as white as a corpse's flesh, patches of skin around his eyes, jaw, and neck were scabbed a rough, dark gray by denticles, lending his skin a scaly texture. Shah had recently started to note the first outbreaks of the genetic anomaly on his own flesh, scabbing his elbows and shoulder joints. It was just one of the many afflictions suffered by the older members of the chapter, and the condition would only degenerate as time passed. With the exception of the slumbering greats in their white suits of dreadnought armor, Te Kaharangi was by far the oldest member of the chapter. Shah had heard it said that he was only 3 generations removed from the wandering ancestors, the first to have gone into the void, alone, at the behest of the Forgotten One.
"The company needs leadership now,"
said Te Kaharangi.
"Your leadership, Shah. This will be no ordinary tithing."
"So you have said."
"The boy must be found,"
Te Kaharangi continued, voice a dry, dead whisper in the armory's echoing vaults.
"The murderers in the night have his scent. If the one called Kirimate sinks his claws into him, the suffering for all will be great. 'Tis not enough to complete the tithe. We must reach the boy before the heretics."
"We will find him," Shah said, "and complete the tithe for the chapter."
"It will be your first true test as company master."
"Then I welcome it, Void Brother." Te Kaharangi glanced back down the length of the armory.
86 functioning suits of battle plate recovered from the war in the deeps. 79 Void Brothers to fill them. And you yourself, plagued by doubt, at this dark homecoming. Are we enough for the tithe, given what awaits us?
"On our shoulders rests the future of the chapter," Baal Shah said, looking once again at Akia's power armor. His armor. He laid his hand once more upon the chain axe's head. "We are Karkaradon Astra, Chief Librarian. From the outer dark we come, and when the red tithe is over, we will leave behind only darkness, nothing more." Gene scan complete. Access granted. Beginning Membank entry log. Date check. 3555875.M41. Day 46. Kelliston Local. I have checked the subsector way station logs at the request of Gideos. He is convinced something vital is occurring, and has been for days. His nightmares have kept half of Lord Rosencrantz's retainers awake at night. I couldn't stand it anymore. It seems his warp dreams are not wholly misplaced. A penal ship out of Fallowrain checked into a way station in the Spiral Arm a week ahead of schedule. Gideos thinks that's the one which the portents have been showing him. I'm going to need to run further checks before I go to Lord Rosencrantz and request clearance to leave this miserable place. The business here on Kelliston still hasn't been tied up yet. The local administratum quillheads are dragging proceedings out, as is their way. Chasing some rogue penal ship to the edges of Imperial void space may be just the excuse I need to get away from this dead-end investigation. Signed, Interrogator Orgim Nzogwu. Membank entry log ends. Thought for the day. Work earns salvation. Chapter 2. It was the night before the harvest. A time of breathless, desperate yearning. A time of preparation and anticipation. A time the Prince of Thorns had come to savor. Amon Kal stared out of the primary viewing port of the Last Breath. The Prince of Thorns stared back at him. Naked, jet hair lying lank about his shoulders. Corpse-white flesh puckered with neural ports and scarred by ritual kill tallies. Kal raised one hand and watched the prince mirror the movement in the crystal flecks, all the while maintaining eye contact. The ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, exposing the tips of his steel teeth. The revenant in the void smiled back. He dropped his hand and looked beyond the nightmarish figure, black eyes refocusing on the dark orb that framed his reflection. Zartak. It was not an impressive sight. A small planetoid, a sphere of green, rugged rock on the fringes of a star system on the fringes of a galaxy. A place easily forgotten. A place well suited to Amon Kal's needs. The harvest was overdue. They had dallied, first on Nemesis, then in the Talith system. It had been understandable, given how hungry the warband was for fresh victims. A slight shiver ran up Cull's spine as he remembered the screams. He'd drawn them out, just as his brothers had drawn out what was supposed to be a simple supply raid, lavishing their prisoners with every pain they could conceive of. They'd left a week behind schedule, and only then because the Augurs had detected a powerful naval squadron breaking in system in a vain effort to intercept them. Nemisar and Talith had been pleasurable distractions, but distractions nonetheless. Zartak was where they needed to be, a place of lost and imprisoned souls, sharply concentrated into a dozen mining structures, burrowed in amongst the inimical jungles that carpeted the humid orb. Aside from the arbitrators and prison overseers, every single person below was a convict laborer. They were all ripe for the harvest. The flesh at the nape of Cull's neck itched. He indulged the sensation, imagining the serrated edge of a combat knife sliding home. At least a dozen eyes staring at his back wished to impale him right there and then, and that was only counting the Genhansed ones. Cull delighted in such knowledge, delighted in the fact that it was their fear of his skill with a blade that kept them at bay. A sound disturbed the awful quiet of the Last Breath's bridge, a grating of time-worn alarm bells. Hunchbacked thralls scurried to deactivate them. Cull didn't need to ask what they presaged. The ship's auger arrays had detected the Imperial truth, breaking in system from its warp jump. Another 8 hours would see the penal ship in high anchor above Zartak, joining Cull's concealed fleet in the doomed mining colony's orbit. Then, at last, the wait would be over. "Armor," the Prince of Thorns said. The voice was young, as cold, clean, and cutting as a freshly scrubbed razor. The black-robed thralls of his personal retinue hurried to attend him, each laboring beneath the weight of a separate piece of battleplate. The design was ancient, Mark IV, daubed midnight blue and edged with bands of bronze. The scarred amalgamation of shaped plasteel, adamantium, and ceramite had borne the brunt of the long war for millennia, well before Cull had been conceived. Regardless of its venerable age, the prince had ordered customizations when he had taken possession of it from the warband's previous master. Jagged spikes now bristled from its pauldrons, greaves, and breastplate, and the leering winged skull motif of the 8th Legion was entwined with his own heraldry, the crest of House Cull, a black venom rose and its wicked poisoned thorns. Layer by layer, the thralls clothed Cull for murder. The autosense links went in first, sliding with familiar little stabs of pain into the neural ports and flesh sockets that penetrated his black carapace. The servo plates and fiber bundles were next, the machine muscles that would augment the prince's already transhuman strength. After that, the armor itself, dark as a nightmare, old as the sins of the martyred Gene-Father Cull would never know. The thralls clamped each part to the electroid sealant strips without speaking, the bridge quiet except for the click and grate of cold metal. The pauldrons came last. It took 2 thralls to lift and lock each one in place, their calloused hands bloody from the spines that bristled across the dark steel. The servos in the power armor whirred and hummed as they came fully online. Cull smiled again. Sentath, his chief thrall and the only human dreg he'd deigned to name, stepped forwards. In his aging hands, he clasped a great warhelm. Its visor had been molded into the shape of a screaming skull, the bone white a sharp contrast to the darkness of the rest of Cull's armor. From its sides rose back-swept red pinions, fashioned like the ragged wings of a bat. It was the very image of the 8th Legion's heraldry. The top of the skull was covered in a ridge of bony horn nubs, echoing the spikes that bristled across the rest of Cull's plate. The deactivated red lenses set into the skull's sockets glittered a dark, dead shade of ruby. Cull took the helm from the struggling thrall with one hand, placing it over his head without ceremony. The necklock hissed as it sealed with his gauntlet, and the Vox grill wheezed and rattled like a dying man. For a second, he was in darkness. For a second, he was cowering once more in the shadows of the palace that he had once called home, eyes screwed tight shut, whimpering as murderers clad in lightning stalked his halls. Then the helm's presight activated, and the bridge returned, rendered now in bloody crimson. White icons overlaid his vision one by one, blinking into existence as his autosensors came online. Targeting reticules, vital signs, squad designates, ammunition counts, area schematics. He deleted each in turn with a blink click. They were not needed. Not yet. His gaze returned to his reflection in the crystal flex. To the Prince of Thorns. The young murderer. Champion of fear. Night Lord. Now midnight-clad. Ready to kill. Damn the so-called Long War veterans who claimed their young prince was not ready. Senzar, he said, voice transformed into a deep, deathly whisper that rattled from the death-masked vox grill. Are the claws prepared?
Yes, my prince,
the Terminator champion answered. With a thought, Kull activated his ancient armor's power coils. Arco lightning ignited, sparking and crackling across vicious spikes, and snapping hungrily at his nightmare reflection. Kull nodded once, satisfied. Then let us begin. Meat parted beneath Shadrath's blade. He watched it happen in silence, marveling at the way in which the flaps of flesh came apart with gentle reluctance beneath the slight pressure of the scalpel. Marveling, too, at the man's screams, not unlike a broken grok sow, lowing and tired, weary with the pain that had been heaped upon its meaningless existence. Shadrath wondered, sometimes, whether, during his previous life, he'd been a butcher, or slaughter-yard laborer, or maybe just a psychopath. There had been plenty of those on Nostromo. Shadrath removed the blade and straightened, momentarily sated. Between them, the last 211 victims had gone some way to easing his communion with Bargul. The ancient demon had been ignoring Shadrath of late, its messages ever more distant and disconnected from reality. Now, though, the sorcerer could feel the warp creature's attention upon him again, drawn through the immaterium by the pain Shadrath was bleeding into the warp's depths.
Another,
he ordered, his voice a dead hiss that rattled from the vox of his horned helmet. Two stooped acolyte things dragged the screaming man from the slab, struggling as he writhed. Two more heaved another prisoner up onto the rack. He was barely conscious, still under the effects of the Phobos gas Shadrath had flooded the ship with before they'd boarded. This one wore the white uniform of a bridge vox operator. Shadrath stripped it off with short, precise snips of his surgical scissors. He'd removed his gauntlets to make the work easier, his long, clawed fingers stained bright red. The Night Lord had commandeered the Medicae Bay of the Imperial Truth for his grisly work. It had been the natural choice. It already had all the tools he needed, from incision blades and bone saws to dissection tables and restraint clamps. He'd hung the flayed skins of 24 of the ship's bridge staff from the coolant pipes and venting ducts overhead, draping the whole bay in bare, bloody meat. He'd also had his acolytes clog the floor drains so that now, after several days of effort, the blood was lapping around the soles of his boots. The tiled walls, once a pristine surgical white, had been painted crimson. Such activities were as much a hobby to Shadrath as they were an effort to communicate with his demonic ally. It spoke to him of home, of distant, long-lost Nostromo, and of better days with battle brothers who had understood the true talents of the Night Lords. Causing pain and terror had once been goals in themselves. Now, they were merely afterthoughts to the likes of Kull and the pack of inexperienced warriors Shadrath was forced to ally himself with. Almost none of them had even been alive during the great and glorious days of the 8th Legion's liberation, when they had slipped the leash of the false emperor and painted the stars red. The upstarts were an embarrassment to the Long War, and a testimony to how far the ideals of the Night Haunter had fallen. They were a means to an end, the Chaos Sorcerer reminded himself as he scooped out an eyeball. Soon, with Bargul's blessing, he would have what he sought. Then, he need humor the self-proclaimed Prince of Thorns no longer. He felt the presence of Vorphex, cold as a long-dead cadaver, slide into the bay. He didn't look up from his work. "We have cleared the asteroid belt," the Raptor Claw leader said, his voice vox cutting through the screaming of the sorcerer's latest captive.
"The shields?"
Shadrath asked, leaning a little closer to the struggling, breathless man. "Damaged, but still functional. They'll be enough."
"And the Vox array?"
"Intact. We have a full, uninterrupted connection with Zartak. No word from the Prince or the rest of the fleet. They're still shrouded on the dark side of the planet.
Excellent,
Shadrath said, finally looking up at his fellow Night Lord. Vorfax was one of the few members of the warband he considered to have anything approaching experience. If anything, Shadrath would have sponsored Vorfax to be its leader over Kull, if he had believed he could manipulate the older Night Lord the way he already did the so-called Prince of Thorns.
Continue transmitting everything the Vox thieves captured,
Shadrath told him.
And prepare your claw for the arrival of our new guests.
As you wish, Flight Father. The harvest was about to begin. Rannick armored herself in haste. Makran's shock squads were the best arbitrators on Zartak, and possessed a personal armory in the heart of the precinct fortress's highest flak tower. The precinct itself was a blocky sprawl of enclosed rockcrete bastions, bulwarks, and plasteel baffles, perched precariously on the crag edge of the so-called burrow, Sinkshaft 1, Zartak's largest penal mine. The sub-precincts that overlooked the other smaller workings sunk into the planetoid's adamantium-rich crust were far less impressive affairs. Generally nothing more than a curtain wall and a squat rockcrete keep. The shock squad armory alone displayed the disparity between the main fortress and the sub-precinct that Rannick had jurisdiction over. The carapace armor she unhooked from a reserve locker was far sturdier than her own, a collection of matte black flak plates striped with yellow hazard chevrons and fitted over polyplastic fiber weave, each part clipped and fastened snugly on top of Rannick's black body glove. She settled the open-jawed helmet in place, adjusted the Vox Talk around her throat, and snapped down the polarizing visor lens. Last of all, she pulled on the suit's armored lock gloves. The weaponry lining the walls was just as comprehensive as the armor. Las and hard round vied with rows of grenade variants and half a dozen types of suppression mace. Rannick resisted the urge to select one of the big, scarred Sinford pattern lock shields from the upper racks. She locked her own auto pistol and shock maul to the mag strips of her armor's belt, and clamped a heavy Vox Leggy pattern combat shotgun and shell bandolier to the block on her backplate. She gave herself 5 seconds to take a breath and stare at her reflection in the changing bay mirror. Hazel eyes and a slender, pale young face stared back, capped by close-cropped black hair. "This is what you wanted," she told herself. "Stop hesitating." She took the grav lift to the tower's shuttle bay, tightening and settling straps as she waited. With a flicker of annoyance, she realized that her heart was already racing. She'd spent years training and drilling for precisely this moment. Now that it was happening for real, it was supposed to be as simple as any other simulation exercise. But it suddenly didn't seem simple at all. The wire doors of the lift jutted open, and she stepped out into Bay 14. The screaming of jets and the backwash of idling engines hit her hard. Head down, she forced herself into it. Ahead of her, armored figures were filing up into the open rear of a Mark 9 tri-wing lighter, framed by the backdrop of landing lumens and the starry night sky that yawned beyond the bay's open blast doors. "Wait!" she shouted, but her words were snatched away by the engine noise. She broke into a jog, grimacing. She wasn't going to let them leave her behind. The last figure up the tri-wing's ramp paused at the hatch and glanced back. The cockpit lights lit up her scarred features. Yen Makran. She scowled as she caught sight of Rannick. "Well, come on then, warp damn you," she snapped, gesturing through the hatch. Rannick ducked inside. The last of Makran's 3 teams had already filled the shuttle's hold and strapped into the metal fold-down restraining benches. They looked up as she entered, jawlines grim beneath the edges of their helms, eyes inscrutable behind the black visors of their photosensitive lenses. Makran thrust Rannick forcibly down into the last harness by the hatch and banged the locking rune. The pitch of the shuttle's engines rose to a painful shriek. Makran tapped her Vox Talk. "What?" Rannick tried to shout above the rising noise, then realized what she was telling her to do. She hastily activated the comms device. Makran sat down on the bench opposite and snapped the restraints over her shoulders. Her voice crackled in her ear. "You know Klen only supported your request to be here because he's praying some Savlar on this damn penal ship splits your head open with a rusty crowbar. I assume that's why you agreed to take me with you as well. If you get any of my men killed, then I promise you Klen will get his wish. I'll snap your damn neck myself and dump your body out an airlock. Do you understand?" "Perfectly, Master-at-Arms," Rannick said, and forced herself to smile. As the shuttle juddered with takeoff turbulence, she realized she'd never been more afraid in her entire life. The boy cowers behind a statue of his supposed great-grandfather and screws his eyes tight shut while his parents die. They are not his real parents. His real parents are thieves, or extortionists, or obscura addicts, or blasphemers, or murderers. They are any number of hateful Savlar underhivers. He does not know them. He has never met them. His adoptive parents were the masters of Hive Apraxis, Lord and Lady of the Venom Rose Thorns, the ancient House Kull, firstborn of the lineage of Saint Yarwain. They are masters no longer. The new rulers of Apraxis are skinning his parents alive.
Where are you, boy?
The vox shriek of their leader screams down the hallway, so sharp it seems to cut the child's ears. The boy whimpers pitiably. The agony of his false parents has long since been reduced to moaning and sobs, echoing through the cold, bare, blood-slashed marble of their palace-turned-slaughterhouse. They have already screamed their throats raw.
You did this,
whispers another voice, the little one in the boy's head. He clamps his small hands over his ears, desperate to silence it, desperate to stop the lightning-clad killers from hearing it. The words still come, though, reaching him from inside his skull.
You killed them, Amon. You killed everybody. Don't you?
Remember. The Prince of Thorns started. He realized he'd unclamped his rune sword. The curving, Nostramo-marked steel glittering in the flickering light of the teleportation chamber. He blinked and bared his steel fangs. He'd been remembering. That had been happening more often of late. The demon, Bargul, had been helping him recall the time before the hypno-inductions and murder inculcations, before he'd found his purpose and taken the mantle of power that was his by right, before his ascension to the 8th Legion. It was trying to distract him. He thrust the thoughts angrily from his mind. He found the chamber often exacerbated such memories. The demon-haunted vault in the underbelly of the Last Breath tended to act as a conduit for the darkest and most blessed moments of a man's existence. He could tell from the short, sharp breathing and tense postures of First Kill that they too were having similar vision recollections. Kull found it tended to put his retinue on edge just before an engagement, and an edge was exactly what he wanted from them, unyielding, honed, and cutting. The canting of the acolytes arrayed in an 8-pointed star around the 7 Chaos Space Marines neared its crescendo. The stooped, deformed thralls were all bleeding from their mouths, noses, and ears. A few had collapsed, frothing and spasming uncontrollably on the hexagram-marked deck. Normally, Shadraith, the flayed father, would have led the ritual, but he was still on board the captured prison ship, playing with whatever remained of the crew while he waited for the idiot Imperials to come and investigate. Kull focused his thoughts as he felt the heavy air of the chamber beginning to vibrate, running counterpoint to the quiet throb of the Last Breath's masked engines. The shadows that clustered around the edges of the vault had started to stretch and elongate. The ancient cobwebbed lumen orbs suspended from the ceiling flickered and failed one by one. With each dowsing, the darkness rushed forward to claim more of the fear-laden space. The etchings covering the deck had started to glow with a faint, sickly luminance. Another acolyte collapsed. Then another, their mutated bodies thrashing uncontrollably, their choked cries blending with the chanting. The words of those still standing reached a crest of hideous noise, syllables gibbered and spat out in a rush of palpable terror. Kull gripped the flayed skin haft of his rune sword tighter, and felt his secondary heart kick in. Adrenaline and excitement flooded his system. The shadows, claws and talons and snapping maws that slid across the vibrating deck, lunged in unison, and the final lumens died. For a second, the only light was the glow of the teleportation hexagram and the unblinking red illumination of 7 sets of battle helm lenses. Then, amidst disembodied snarls, the tearing of flesh, and the screaming of the last of the acolytes, those too vanished. Nedzi was shouting up at him from the cell below, perched on top of his bunk, manacled hands clutching the mesh wiring that separated them.
What's going on, weirdling?
How should I know?
Skell bawled back over the clattering of the alarms. His ears were starting to ache as badly as his forehead.
You always know, you little freak! Tell me!
Go blow off some obscura, Nedzi.
They should have stopped by now, Dolar moaned from the top bunk, hands clamped over his ears. Skell opened his mouth to shout a reply, then stopped. A sudden, indefinable sense of fear kept the words locked behind his jaw. He rose in his bunk, as far as his magnicles would allow. With the extra height, he was able to get a view out of the cell hatch slit. The tiny space he shared with Dolar was on level 43 of 50. When Imperial colonists had first founded the primary minehead, Sinkshaft 1, they had borrowed their habitations into the hull's flanks. The great vertical tunnel digging into Zartak's core was long exhausted, but was now the open-air nexus for the burrow, the latticework of hundreds of secondary mines spreading like a subterranean web from the old shaft. The habitation honeycomb of the shaft itself had been converted into Zartak's primary prison, its sheer circular sides riddled with tens of thousands of tiny cells and cages like Dolar and Skells, jutting out into oblivion. The slip of vision afforded through the hatch gave Skell a view directly across to the outside of the cells on the opposite curve of the shaft, over 100 yards away. It was still dark, and dawn was a long way off. For a while, Skell could see nothing but the flickering of the crimson emergency lights. Then he caught a hint of movement. He squinted, trying to focus. There were shadows flitting up the far side of the shaft. The emergency lights touched whatever metal plates they were wearing, staining their midnight surfaces like fresh blood. They weren't so much climbing as darting upwards. Strange-looking, archaic packs strapped to their backs, offering them a means of propulsion up the sheer flanks of the prison pit. Skell counted 7 of them, shadows within shadows. The light caught the flicker and flash of naked steel alongside the darker gleam of their armor. Skell had seen plenty of killers in his short life. He knew he was watching 7 right now, ascending as though from the black heart of Zartak itself, like the sump-sink earth-shades of Falloraine's darkest legends, up towards the starry heavens beyond the edge of the pit, up towards the base of the void shield generator, perched on the opposite side of the sink shaft. One of the shades paused, latching itself onto an overhanging gable jutting from between 2 of the prison cells. For a moment, it seemed to dangle there, bat-like, inhuman and predatory. A chill ran through Skell as he realized the thing was facing him.
What is it?
Dolar shouted over the alarms. He was struggling to lower himself from his bunk to Skell's height, but he couldn't get down to the same angle before his magnicles whirred taut and locked. He grunted with the effort. Skell ignored him. He was shaking. Every instinct was screaming at him to look away from the suspended figure, to get away from the hatch, get down in his bunk, cover his eyes and pray to a god-emperor he'd never believed in before now. But he couldn't. For some reason, he couldn't look away. He felt sick. His skull throbbed. The flickering emergency lights caught the shade, illuminating its face for the first time. Its head was a winged death mask, its eyes glaring from the pits of bone-white sockets, meeting his gaze and holding it in a vice of cold iron. It was the same nightmare vision he had dreamt about, almost every night since he'd arrived on Zartak. They have come for you. As abruptly as they'd started, the alarm snapped off. Their aftershock echoed back from the circular cliff sides of the sink prison, rebounding within the inmates' throbbing heads. With the alarms went the emergency lighting. Suddenly, there was nothing beyond the cell but darkness. First Kill froze. The darkness embraced them like an old friend. Cull turned away from the cell across the sink shaft from him, his claws tightening around the plasteel gable. The sudden silence after the hammering of the alarms was startling. He blink-clicked Third Claw's Vox channel.
Thexrath,
He hissed.
we're in position. Begin your assault.
They caught the Imperial Truth on its final approach to Zartak's high orbit. Schultz had relayed the good news that the ship's crew still controlled its weapons systems. That meant divine retribution. An Imperial Navy fast cutter permanently seconded to the Zartak Adeptus Arbites garrison was able to get in close before launching her boarding torpedoes.
Terminate with extreme prejudice,
Macran said over the Vox. Rannick shifted a shoulder plate into a more comfortable position, cursing the sweat that was running into her eyes behind her helmet's lenses. At least she could blame it on the infernal heat of the torpedo troop bay. The rest of the shock squad were packed around her, 4 behind, and the rest in front. The 2 lead arbitrators already had their heavy ceramite suppression shields up. The metal tube of the torpedo's narrow interior was bathed in ugly red light. A jagged warning bell started to clatter.
brace.
Macran ordered. Rannick just had time to snatch the handrail running along the top of the compartment before an impact battered her back into the armor of the arbitrator behind. She heard the man grunt and curse. For a second, she thought they'd successfully impacted with the Imperial Truth's outer hull. Then she realized the backward thrust had been the torpedo's dampener drives kicking in. The true impact occurred a moment later. This time, she was able to stay upright as the false gravity of the boarding craft attempted to drive her forwards. The metal around her shuddered and groaned as the torpedo earthed itself into what Rannoch prayed was the flank of the Imperial Truth's bridge mast. The warning chime shut off, and for a second, all Rannoch could hear was her breath rasping in her ears.
30 seconds!
Crackled Macran's voice. In her mind's eye, Rannoch saw the heavy melters arrayed around the torpedo's snub prow blazing, the sounds of vaporized adamantium lost in the vacuum of the void. She saw the plasteel and ceramite sheath of the equalizer judder forwards on automatic lock hinges, covering the molten hull bored by the melters. She heard the thump of compression, felt the magnetic seal shudder through the frame of the boarding vessel. She was suddenly, acutely aware of an itch in her right thigh. The sweat in her eyes stung. The Vox Leggy shotgun, held by the stock in her free hand, seemed unbearably heavy.
10 seconds,
said Macran.
Make ready, arbitrators!
The crack of primed weapons was loud in the close, heated space. Rannoch let go of the overhead rail to rack her shotgun slide. The motion stabbed a fresh spike of adrenaline through her body. The warning chime sounded again, just once. The red light bathing the troop bay flashed amber, and then green. There was a crump of door clamps, a rush of steam, a burst of hissing, decompressed air. The shock squad were shouting. They were going forwards. Rannoch was in amongst them, half advancing, half carried along by their black-armored momentum. The bellowed oaths of the Statutes Imperialis were deliberately amplified over the arbitrators' external vox beads as they stormed the Imperial Truth, but their law cries fell only on an empty corridor. Rannoch ducked in beneath the fused molten rim of the breach and found herself in the center of a knot of arbitrators, the front rank holding their shields braced, those behind with shotguns raised. According to the snap briefings delivered by Macran on board the Divine Retribution, they would be entering via one of the many service corridors ringing the Imperial Truth's aft bridge mast. As part of the prison ship's outer shell, the narrow passageways acted as a network for the repair crews and maintenance servitors to quickly reach more important sections. They were narrow, dank places, rarely visited. Like the exterior vanes of most starships, they were considered entirely non-vital and provided with only a modicum of dingy lighting, heat, and servicing. It was in just such a dim, confined world of rusting pipes and fungus-choked mesh decking that the shock squad now found themselves. There were no life signs.
Quiet,
Macran ordered.
Reassemble. There should be a grav lift to the inner mast shaft 50 yards to the right. Felch it. Take point.
The shock squad shook itself into a tightly spaced line, weapons still ready. Rannoch kept her positioning, remembering to keep her finger off the Vox Leggy's trigger. She could do this. She could show them she was just as efficient, just as capable as any arbitrator on Zartak. The tunnel bent continuously to the left, following the curve of the circular bridge mast. It resounded with the clang of the shock squad's steel-shod boots and the rattle and grate of their carapace armor. Rannoch tried to maintain her focus, scanning the pipe-lined walls as they passed, shotgun probing the shadows between the flickering lumen orbs. Macran had told them not to anticipate many contacts in the outer shell. Going by Captain Van Hoyt's descriptions, the ship's escaped prisoners were still disorganized. They were besieging the bridge and the enginarium, but had failed to capitalize on their numerical superiority by occupying much of the rest of the ship. It was a mistake the shock squads wouldn't let them recover from. They were boarding from 5 separate breach points, targeting the starboard weapons batteries, the enginarium, the bridge mast, the navigator's tower, and the primary armory. The ship's vital parts would be secured at a stroke, and the breakout suppressed. Macran had warned her teams she expected them to finish the job before the Warden Primary's reinforcements had even made it up from Zartak's surface.
Grav lift secure,
came the vox crackle from Felchit, the point man. It was a big servicing chute, large enough to carry stocks of replacement circulation pipes or sheets of adamantium plating to the outer hull. The arbitrators filed inside. Macran yanked the activation lever. With a judder and an unhealthy grating whir, the platform began to rise. As the lift climbed into the tower's central shaft, reports from the other shock squad started filtering back over the Vox. All 4 had made successful breaches in the outer hull. Thus far, they had encountered no resistance. In fact, none of the teams were reporting any signs of life at all. The Auspex readings were jagged and full of ghost returns, and heads-up tactical displays kept going dark. Even as Macran received the information, the Vox shorted and jumped, chopped to pieces by static distortion.
Something's interfering with our systems,
she said over the short-range Vox talk. The Savlar may have been able to create some sort of jamming device from the main Vox relay. Taking it out will be our primary objective once the bridge is secure. The gravlift jutted to a halt. The arbitrators closest to the door locked their suppression shields together, forming an impenetrable barrier of ceramite. The doors rolled back. Another empty corridor presented itself. The only noise, the distant throb of the Imperial Truth's still active plasma drives. The shock squad moved smoothly out of the lift, shotguns tracking the flickering shadows. The bridge mast's central shaft was far less dilapidated than the outer shell, but the lumen orb still seemed to be on the verge of failing. Rannick tried to focus on maintaining her spacing and watching her zone. She felt ridiculously clumsy and out of place amidst the tightly drilled formation. "Stair shaft. Next right," came the voice of Felchett. "It leads directly to the outer doors of the bridge," McCran added. "Stay alert." There were still no contacts. Transmissions from the other shock squads had ceased. It was as though they'd penetrated a ghost ship, abandoned centuries earlier, listing through the void for eternity. Rannick's skin prickled, and she almost smacked into the backplate of the arbitrator in front. The squad had come to a halt at the foot of the stairwell leading up to the bridge deck. The lumen orbs in the shaft had gone out completely. The darkness seemed to deny them, as firm and black as their suppression shields. "Stab lumens," McCran ordered. The lights flicked on, picking out corroded metal rungs and scabs of dark steam mold. The beams wavered and shifted with the movement of the arbitrator's shotguns. "Felchett, Hormond, switch out," McCran said. Felchett dropped back for the second arbitrator in line to take point up the stairs. "Move off." The shock squad began to climb, the clanging of boots on plasteel ringing up through the stairwell. For the first time since boarding the lighter in the precinct fortress, Rannick felt something besides adrenaline and jaggy combat nerves. A dark, creeping sense of foreboding. Something wasn't right. The feeling only grew when she realized what was missing. While the narrow space was still loud with the sounds of the arbitrator's boots, none of those noises were coming from behind her anymore. An icy shiver ran down her spine. She spun, shotgun up, the stab lumen beaming back down the stairwell. Of the 4 arbitrators who had been bringing up the rear, there was no sign. "We've reached the head of the stairs," cracked Horman's voice. "Still no contacts. I have a visual on the bridge blast doors. They're not sealed." "Wait," Rannick stammered over the Vox talk. "Stop! Everyone stop!" "Damn it, I told you to keep quiet," McCran snarled. "They're behind us." "Who?" "I don't know. The 4 behind me. They're gone. I didn't hear anything." "Squad, halt," McCran said. "Sound off." 4 names were missing from the roll. Rannick stared down at the last landing, bare and silent beneath her. She felt frozen, as though to move would trigger whatever mysterious fate had already befallen those who'd been following her. She realized, with a strange, chill sense of detachment, that her hands were shaking. The little involuntary movements were causing the light from her lumen to waver and dart across the mouldy walls. McCran was still trying to reach the 4 missing arbitrators over the Vox. None replied. The darkness seemed to creep in around the light of Rannick's beam, hardening at the edges like a predator tensing, ready to strike. Eventually, McCran cut the Vox links. "We carry on," she said. "But," Rannick began. "We carry on, Sub-Warden. Unless you want me to report you to the primary once we get this warped-down place secured." Rannick backed all the way up the last steps. When she finally emerged at the top, she found herself in a vaulted atrium. The lumens sat into arched alcoves, though weak, or at least functioning. The far end of the atrium was dominated by a vast set of doors, twice Rannick's height, and stamped with the interlocking eye and ship's wheel of the Imperial Navy. The bridge blast doors. The shock squad had assembled before them in a defensive semicircle. "Where are the prisoners?" Rannick asked. "I thought you said they were attacking the bridge—" "Quiet!" McCran snapped. "Hormond?" "They're not locked, sir," said the point man, as he inspected the door's brass-rimmed locking panel. "Nothing on the Vox either," McCran said. "Maintain firing positions. Shield ranks, brace. Hormond, open it." There was a clatter as the shock squad made ready. Rannick took position behind the stooping figure of one of the suppression shield bearers. She couldn't resist the urge to glance back at the yawning darkness of the stairwell behind them, even as Hormond disengaged the blast door hinge clamp and hauled up the locking rod from its brace in the deck. The heavy adamantium plates rolled back smoothly, automatic hinges whirring. A foul stench wafted from within. It was immediately apparent that they were all much, much too late. Bargle's demonkin slaughtered the boarders. Shadraith watched them do it, secreted in what had once been the Imperial Truth's navigator tower. He spirit-walked the darkened corridors of the captured ship, observing from the whispering shadows as horrors of pulsing, unnatural flesh materialized from nowhere, tearing apart the Imperials foolish enough to step into their new lair. He disrupted their communication nets, both long and short-ranged, with Vox thieves, so that each group was unaware of the grisly fate of the others. It was all far too easy. A greater challenge waited on the surface of the world below, amidst the prison tunnels and mine shafts. Shadraith yearned for it.
"Here's our future,"
Bargle told him, the words echoing inside his skull.
"The weaves of fate have now bound us all together. Find him for me."
Shadraith had never taken well to warders, demonic or otherwise. Like all Night Lords, he looked dimly upon the creatures of the warp and their arcane pacts, even as one whose very power was drawn from the maddening sea in which they swam. He had long ago decided that his abilities did not derive from some indecipherable creature's base whims. It was within him, in the strength it took to harness such horrors.
"Where is he?"
Shadraith demanded. His consciousness was returning once again to the navigator's tower, to his body, the figure known to his brothers as the Flayed Father.
"Beneath the surface,"
Bargle said. The demon's voice was distant, as though carried on a faint night wind.
"Others are coming to claim him. They must not succeed. Others? The hunters in the void. Your lost brothers. That means nothing to me. Do not speak your senseless riddles, demon. The pale nomad and the rest of his mongrel, exiled kin. You have seen him with your foresight. You will know them when he arrives. Find the boy before he does. I will, and when you do, bind him to me. And you will give me the powers you've promised. Of course."
Shadraith looked up at the crystal flex observation blister that constituted the tower's domed ceiling. They had caught the Imperial Truth in the depths of the warp, 2 days out from the Midway listening station at Gorgas. Shadraith's ritual had successfully split the ship's Gellerfield long enough for Bargle's demonic horrors to overrun the crew. The Night Lords had taken possession of it, and broken from the warp in time to check in at Gorgas with Vox recordings falsified through Shadraith's dark arts. The trap had been baited and set. Past the crystal flex, the stars glittered, a firmament of shining silver on black velvet. Beyond them, there was nothing. Here on the edge of the galaxy, among the haunted asteroids and dying stars of Oblivion's edge, the void yawned. What was out there, coming to Zartak through the eternal dark? Shadraith's mind had been plagued by visions of inky black eyes and pale, dead flesh. Bargle had faced this enemy before. That they had survived an encounter with the ancient demon was evidence of the threat they posed. He rose, warp scythe grasped in one gauntlet. The ancient flesh pinned his armor, crackling. He was needed on the surface. The final blow was poised, ready to be struck. Then the hunt for the boy could begin. Down in the depths of the White Moor, the Greats slumbered. There were 3 of them. 3 wandering ancestors, their bones reduced to ossified cartilage, sealed away for eternity in the adamantium shells of their contemptors. The ancient dreadnoughts slept, as they had done for the better part of a millennium. The frames of the war machines locked and inert upon a shingle-like dais at the center of the half-flooded chamber. Omicra 51 Cordy paid tribute to the slumbering warriors. He was one of 6 Carcharodons kneeling in the lapping waters of the Bay of Silence, unarmored, his plain robe soaked through. The vaulted chambers of the lower decks, carved from great blocks of craggy basalt, were filled with meltwater. Normally, the vast room would have been frozen during void travel, the better to preserve its 3 venerable occupants. The imminent break into real space, however, meant that the thermal cycles had been restarted. Soon, it would be possible to awake the Greats, if circumstances demanded. Cordy prayed they would not. The 4th Squad Tactical Marine focused his mind. seeking the inner silence that was a key part of every Carcharodon's pre-battle ritual. All sought such solace. It reminded them of the emptiness of existence beyond the Void Father's light, of the insignificance of the individual self. War was a frenzied beast, a primal thing of thunderous roars and howls, but it did not last forever. The silence had existed before it, and when war lay down and died, the silence returned. The void was the only constant, the certainty of an eternal emptiness. Cordy let his surroundings melt like the ice that had once entombed the chamber. The chill of the water lapping around his thighs faded, merging with the muted throb of the ship's warp drives. The presence of the other Carcharodons kneeling either side of him slipped away too. They had all come here from disparate parts of the battle company, each drawn by personal needs. For his own part, Cordy was trying to forget. Flashes of a past life, of sandy shores and clear seas, would invade his consciousness at inopportune moments. It was always the same at the start of a new operation. Even after almost a century, the hypno-inductions and indoctrination drills hadn't managed to erase all of the boy that had existed before the void had come for him. Cordy hated the memories. They were only fragmentary shards, but they clashed with the sense of purpose he now felt as part of the company. He had consulted Apothecary Tama numerous times, but there was no cure. The induction process had been imperfect, as it so often was with the Carcharodon's limited resources. Cordy had been informed that, Void Father willing, his last few pre-initiation memories would fade with time. Until then, communion in the calming presence of the greats was the only thing that brought him focus. Cordy let the silence roll over him, his eyes on the three great, unmoving pillars of metal. Their armored shells shimmered with the murky lumen light that reflected back off the surrounding water, the flickering patterns at odds with their own stillness. The black helm lenses, set low in their armored shoulders, were dull and lifeless, staring out over the shaven heads of the kneeling Carcharodons with corpse-like vacancy. In his mind's eye, Cordy saw the three creatures within, little more than torn amalgamations of white flesh, thick with scar tissue, and the dentical scabs caused by their aged, defective gene seed. Their thoughts were faint and distant, swimming deep below the surface consciousness, sliding blissfully through the dark, numbing waters of oblivion. Cordy sought to join them. He closed his eyes, his breathing deep and regular, feeling his heart slowing as his body relaxed in the icy waters. The woman smiled at him, her arms open, the encouragement warm on her sun-kissed face. He took a few tottering steps. The old man beside him held out a liver-spotted hand, catching him before he fell. Laughter drifted across the golden sands. Cordy's eyes snapped open, a snarl twisting his thin lips. The memory blazed through the darkness of his mind like a comet, fiery and sudden. His secondary heart kicked in with an automatic muscle jolt, and his fists clenched in the water. The sound of his involuntary anger disturbed the other Carcharodons. Cordy could sense their displeasure, their bowed heads half turning in his direction. He let out a low, hissing breath from between his sharpened teeth, willing the sudden bloodlust that gripped him to subside. Regaining his silence, Cordy stood, nodded once in deference to the greats, and backed out of the chamber. The warp jump to real space was drawing close, and with it, the promise of slaughter. If oblivion couldn't smother the memories of who he had once been, then Cordy would wash them away with blood. Gene scan complete. Access granted. Beginning Membank entry log. Date check. 360-6875.M41. Day 65. Kelliston Local. I have just received word via the astropathic choir from Lord Rosencrantz. He has approved the transferal, thank the God Emperor. Apparently he trusts Gideos and his nightmares more than I do. I'm leaving Rochfort and the two Lex mechanics to continue what little is left of the investigation here on Kelliston. I'm taking the rest of the retinue out to Zartak. Rosencrantz and Gideos have both been stressing haste. I'm more than happy to oblige. The faster I can get away from this mire of politicos and bureaucrats, the better. Signed, Interrogator Orgim and Zogu. Membank entry log ends. Thought for the day. A small mind is easily filled with faith. Chapter 3. Arbitrator Norrin snatched at his magnoculars and trained them on the distant tree line, twisting the focus ring. Something was definitely moving out there, just beyond the edge of Zartak's jungles.
Lumens, he ordered over the Vox. 4.4 degrees left of the north gate. Focus!
The heavy spotter beams flashed on, lighting up a patch of jungle tree line. Nothing stirred. Norrin swept his magnoculars across the area, his free hand grasping the edge of the Rockcrete parapet. He was one of a detail of 12 arbitrators assigned to the northern wall of the Void Shield defenses, the command and control facility that edged the rim of Sink Shaft 1. The shock squad that usually acted as the shield's primary garrison had been requisitioned for an orbital operation, and the remaining security halved as the Warden Primary prepared to back them up. The Void Shield garrison was mostly concentrated on the sink-facing ramparts, above the warren structures and hanging bunk cages of the prison cells. There was no threat from outside, from the jungle encroaching on the northern perimeter. Or so Norrin had been told during the snap briefing. His instincts said otherwise. The heavy-duty lumen mounted on the parapet to his left picked out a ragged patch of fronds, but not the slinking shadow he'd seen earlier. Every monthly cycle, a penal section would be requisitioned from the mines to hack back the jungle that was forever seeking to encroach upon the 300-yard kill zone cleared around the edge of the sink shaft. The ground between the Rockcrete wall and the nearest trees was bare and fallow, as undisturbed by movement as the jungle itself.
What is it?
Winston, commander of the North Wall detail, hissed as he reached the arbitrator's side.
Contacts?
I'm not sure,
said Norrin. Before he could elaborate further, his head exploded, splattering Winston's black plate armor with brain tissue.
Throne!
Winston gasped, dropping down beneath the parapet. Norrin's headless corpse slumped next to him. There was a crack and a bang as the lumen blew, hit by another shot from somewhere out beyond the wall. The arbitrators suddenly found themselves in darkness.
Contact! Contact!
Winston hissed into his Vox talk, unclamping his auto rifle and flicking off the safety.
North Wall! Unidentified shooter!
The Rockcrete above him shuddered as it began to take hits, and the boom of heavy caliber discharges reached him from across the kill zone.
Multiple contacts!
Winston corrected himself.
All forces be advised! The north wall of the Void Shield is under attack!
Sir, Vox Chief Hestel began, leaning over the railing of the communications gantry.
I heard,
Schultz snapped.
The shield is under attack.
All eyes in the Centrum Dominus turned to him.
We've also received an activity transcript from the attendant master of the Chorustorium,
the Vox Chief said.
The astropaths are badly agitated. It seems as though something's coming. There's been a disturbance in their dream vigils.
Something means nothing, as far as we're concerned,
Schultz said.
Until we have identification for those attackers at the North Wall, I will not trouble the subsector judges with alarmist reports.
The Void Shield garrison are taking heavy fire,
Hestel said.
Whoever they are, they're well armed.
And made it planetside without being detected, went the unspoken follow-up.
The arbitrator containment section requisitioned from the Void Shield are already prepping in the shuttle bays,
Schultz said.
We've lost all contact with Macran and the shock squads that boarded the Imperial Truth. That's a greater threat right now than some jungle scavengers. Tell the garrison at the Void Shield to get me a proper threat assessment. Then I'll consider whether they need reinforcing or not.
I can't, sir,
said Hestel, hands darting over the rune panels and turning nodes of the Vox Bank.
What? Why not?
I think we just lost contact with them as well.
First Kill shrieked up over the parapets of the Void Shield base from their claw holds in the sink shaft below its walls, the screaming of their jump packs and Voxmores blending with horrific, flawless savagery. The plan was going well. Sink Shaft 1's most competent defenders had been drawn up into the death trap fashioned by Shadraith from the Imperial Truth. Karl and his Raptor retinue had teleported undetected into the depths of the old mine pit itself, and successfully scaled the exterior of the prison cell layers and hanging cages that constituted its sheer flanks. Fexrath and the 2 members of his Third Claw, who had been dropped into the heart of Zartak's equatorial jungle 48 hours earlier, had struck the north side of the Void Shield defenses right on time. The garrison, its numbers already reduced with the effort to pacify the supposed insurrection on board the Imperial Truth, had reacted to the sudden attack by scrambling most of the remaining arbitrators to the north wall facing the tree line. That left 6 men still on the south, overlooking the yawning darkness of the sink shaft. 6 men against the Prince of Thorns and his 6 ablest murderers. The Imperials all died clutching their ears, forced down onto their knees by the sudden, terrible shrieking of the Chaos Raptors. Kull beheaded one with a flick of his rune sword, disappointed by the ease of the kill. Sometimes, there was no room for indulgences. Now was such a time. The Night Lord's victims had barely hit the bloody rockcrete before the Chaos Space Marines were launching themselves down towards the shield's control hub. A void transmission spike lanced the air above the armored building. A pillar of crackling power rods and lit-up transmitter nodes. An arbitrator was scrambling for the wheel lock of the hub's south-facing blast door, stumbling and disorientated by the shock of the Night Lord's oral assault. Carl landed on him from above, the spiked claws of his lower limbs piercing the man's skull and snapping his spine. He was first inside the hub. A rockcrete corridor ended in another set of blast doors, successfully sealed by the defenders. An alarm was clattering somewhere. A tech adept, trailing his red robes, stumbled out from a side door and was casually bisected by Scorer's lightning claws. "Breach!" Carl ordered. Drac, First Kill's demolitions expert, pushed his way to the fore of the retinue, priming a set of mag-locking melter charges as he went. He paused for a moment to assess the obstruction.
Mark 14 Bastion pattern blast doors, manufactured in Adeptus Mechanicus facilities on Griffon 4, or possibly Vos Prime. Primary locking clamps are either side of the central pin bolt, here and here.
"Warp take your damn chatter, Drac!" Carl snapped. "Get it open!"
The Night Lord clamped his twin charges to the points he'd indicated and stepped off to the side.
"Breaching,"
he said, and triggered the detonator device wired to his right vambrace. There was a split second of vibration as the directional limpet charges broke down their molecular pyrum fuel, followed by a bass crump as they fired. The melter blasts, channeled directly into the heavy door, bored 2 molten holes in the adamantium plating. The whole frame shuddered, and a thin crack appeared where the 2 halves of the door had been sealed together.
"Golgoth,"
Carl said. The largest member of First Kill shouldered his way past his brethren. With a grunt, he slammed his charged lightning claws into the fracture in the doors and began to heave. Disruptor energy crackled and sparked as the 8 blades bit into the metal before they eventually found purchase. There was a low grating sound. Golgoth braced himself, head down, the ancient patched servos of his customized power armor shrieking as they added to his already mighty strength. After a second of shuddering resistance, the auto hinges kicked in. With the locks reduced to molten sludge, the heavy doors rolled open. Beyond them, from behind cogitator banks and power coils, the tech priests simply stared.
"Kill them,"
Carl said. The retinue tore into the generator chamber. As they hacked at the screaming, defenseless machine men, Carl stalked towards the central pillar of power coils, coolant valves, and cog blocks. It was the Void Shield's primary generator, and the throb of its core filled the air with static charge. The arco lightning dancing across Carl's armor snapped and crackled in electric sympathy. He remembered. The palace in panic. His false father telling him to stay. Fleeing instead, through the halls and corridors packed with terrified, screaming servants and bellowing royal guards. The rush of demented, reckless glee that had filled him. Bursting into the generator chamber. The old tech priest, Atavus, trying to stop him. Ramming the ceremonial dagger given to him by his false father on his 10th name day through the old monster's sole remaining organic eye. Taking his forged gene key. The one given to him by his false mother. The item that stood for everything that he was not. And using it to begin the palace shield's deactivation sequence. The shield had gone down minutes later. That was when the servants had really started to scream. The last tech priest died, his pitiful wails cut short by Narks. The Night Lord was the youngest member of the retinue, and its most skillful blade master. According to the ancient traditions of Nostramo, he held the title of court executioner.
"Find the cogitator keys,"
Carl ordered him.
"Quickly!"
He switched Vox channels with a blink click, patching into the communication systems of the Last Breath, high above.
"Senzar, are you prepared?"
"Yes, my prince,"
replied the Terminator champion.
"Stand by."
First Kill were rifling through the gory remains of the shield hub's operators, ripping apart blood-stained red robes and cracking open bionic plates. Narks managed to find the brass lever that switched off the alarms. After a few minutes, Drac turned up a memory swipe slate. Xeron found the second. Carl took them both and slid them into the central generator's cogitator bank.
"Give me a hand,"
he ordered. Golgoth scooped one severed limb up off the bloody floor, carrying it awkwardly in his heavy gauntlets. Carl pressed the palm to the scan screen and hit the override rune. The throbbing of the generator began to dip noticeably, fading like a dying heartbeat.
"I can't fully deactivate it without the correct codes, but I put it into maintenance lockdown,"
Carl said.
"That will reduce its strength enough for our purposes.
Contacts on the Auspex, Terran warned. The rest of the garrison are inbound from the North Wall. Much too little, and much too late, Carl said, and switched back to the Last Breath's bridge vox frequency. Shenzar, now! The lumens in the Centrum Dominus went out. It took 3.5 seconds for the emergency strips running along the floor to activate. By then, the killing had already started. There was a crack and a rush of displaced air. 5 figures were suddenly standing in a circle in the room's central cogitator pit. They had appeared like some dark conjurer's trick. Hulking warriors bedecked in thick plates of midnight blue armor, the lightning crackling around their heavy gauntlets, mimicking the splitting bolts painted across their breastplates and pauldrons. As the secondary lumens came online, they opened fire. Schultz dropped down behind a rank of cogitators, hands clasped to his ears, as the room filled with the colossal boom of combi-bolters. A part of him understood that the void shield had been compromised, and that they were experiencing a teleporter attack. Beyond that, everything was raw, mindless panic. The cogitators shuddered and sparked as they took a salvo of bolts. To his right, he saw 2 auger operators go down, their torsos blown open. One of them was the boy who'd first fetched him from the Situation Room debriefing. Schultz fumbled with his auto-pistol, managing to unlock it from his mag belt. "Sir!" wailed Auger Chief Tal. Even as he made to dive into cover beside the warden, a bolt round hit his right arm. The limb disappeared in a burst of blood and shattered bone, spinning him half round. His screaming lasted barely a second before another round struck his head, blowing away the left side of his face. He dropped. "Emperor's wounds!" stammered Schultz, struggling with his pistol's safety. The weapon was sticky with Tal's blood. He could hear Vox Chief Hestel screaming from the gantry, begging for mercy. There was a bang, and the pleading stopped. Suddenly, everything was quiet. The warden went still, his heart hammering. The pool of blood spreading from Tal's remains reached his knees. He didn't move. Heavy footfalls thumped across the deck, accompanied by the whir and grate of power armor. "What are you?" stammered a voice. The warden recognized it as Sub-Warden Klen. There was a crunch, and Klen started screaming. It lasted for a long time. The sounds of footsteps grew louder. A shadow fell across the warden primary. He looked up, shaking, blinking through the sweat and blood. His auto-pistol clattered to the floor. A giant stood over him, bedecked in spiked armor. Its helmet was crafted into a bestial snout with 2 short tusks, like those of a spine boar. Its eye lenses glared a dark, bitter red. The winged skull embossed on its huge breastplate grinned madly. As it reached for him with one great spiked gauntlet, the warden primary finally found the breath to scream. Something was coming. In all his years as attendant master of the Chorustorium on Zartak, Andreas Paul had never been so sure of something. His charges, 4 Gamma-level astropaths, were more agitated than he'd ever seen them. They were spitting and grinding their toothless gums, pale, bare bodies writhing in the cords and cables that bound them into their psi-reactive transmission cradles. One would occasionally emit a brief, yelping shriek that echoed back from the chamber's domed ceiling. The Chorustorium was the link between Zartak and the Imperium, the one thread that bound the distant system, teetering on the edge of galactic oblivion, to the rest of mankind. Andreas had been responsible for overseeing the transmission and receipt of astropathic messages at the station for over 4 decades. In that time, he'd experienced 3 mine uprisings and their suppressions, and more security breaches and smaller riots than he cared to count. But never had he witnessed his charges exhibiting such primal, nameless terror. 2 were experiencing nosebleeds. One had almost ripped himself free from his neural nodes, and Andreas had been forced to clamp him in place. It was as though the sedated psychers were attempting to physically tear themselves from their life-sustaining cradles and flee the chamber. Andreas stood at his usual post, the readout lectern that monitored the vital signs and psych levels of the astropaths. He activated another injection of suppressant stims into all 4 of them, cursing as R-88E tore away one of his subdermal mem stabilizers. "Warp, damn it!" he snapped, and sent another situational jolt through the cogitator system to the Centrum Dominus. Something needed to be done, and fast. Much more stress, and he'd be forced to request permission for a full sedation, and once that happened, no messages would be reaching or leaving Zartak for at least 24 Terran Standard hours. The jolt pinged back on the cogitator screen, unsent.
A frown creased the attendant master's wrinkled brow. With a tap of the rune key, he sent it again. Again it reappeared. Was the system glitching? A sound reached him, echoing along the corridors of the precinct fortress. A rapid, booming tattoo, like the beating of monstrously large bass drums. Many of those who held Andreas's rank had never heard such a noise before, living their whole lives as they did, shielded away in their chorustoriums. But the attendant master had experienced suppressions before. He'd heard screaming, rabid penal scum beating at the very doors of the astropathic chamber. The attack had only stopped with the arrival of the Arbitrator Combat Reserve. The sound of gunfire had heralded the beginning of the suppression, and that was what Andreas knew he was hearing right now. Gunfire echoing up from the bowels of the precinct fortress.
"What in the name of the God Emperor?"
he began to say. He got no further. One of the astropaths, MEL-1E, started to scream. It took him a few seconds to realize that the sounds were actually words. She was repeating them over and over, her head snapping back and forth, as though her sightless eye sockets could see something in the shadows of the domed ceiling above her cradle.
Ave Dominus Nox! Ave Dominus Nox! Ave Dominus Nox!
The archaic High Gothic phrase sent a chill down the attendant master's spine. Hail, Lord of Night. The astropath's words degenerated back into pure, unadulterated screaming. The other three joined in, drowning out the reports of gunfire. Their vital signs were reaching critical. A warning screen began to flash red. The psychoactivity levels were peaking too, and they weren't coming from the astropaths. Andreas gasped as something shifted above him. He looked up to see the impossible. The shadows lurking about the ornate, gargoyle-studded brass dome of the chorustorium were moving. They were physically invading the light cast by the lumen candelabra in the center of the dome, bleeding and shifting down the walls in a manner that defied the possibilities of nature. The orbs began to go out, one by one. One of the cogitator screens in front of Andreas cracked and burst in a shower of sparks. An alarm started to ring, lost amidst the wailing of the astropaths. The shadows continued to move, weaving and coalescing together to form shapes. Talons, maws, leering, snapping beast skulls. With a howl torn from the warp itself, the darkness fell. His charges died first. The shadows took them, wrapping them up in razored death. Their screams became gagged and choked as the darkness flowed into their gaping mouths, rending them open from the inside, setting their cradles rocking as they were savaged and torn from their cabling. Andreas staggered back as dark, insubstantial talons reached for him, coiling like jagged smoke around his readout lectern. The astropaths had gone quiet, as had the distant gunfire. The only sounds now were his panicked breathing and the slow drip of torn offal from the overflowing remains in the psi cradles.
"Emperor, deliver me!"
Andreas stammered, trying to grasp onto the familiar canticle words.
"Shine down your guiding light! Burn away all impurities! Save—"
The shadows recoiled. Andreas missed a beat, staring. It was actually working. The God Emperor himself was interceding on behalf of one of his faithful subjects. He took up the prayer once more, his voice firmer now.
"From the darkness of the Empyrean, deliver us from heresy, deviancy, and mutation. Deliver us against corruption and temptation. Give us strength. All praise and glory unto you, O Master of mankind!"
The shadows contracted all the way to the center of the chorustorium, twisting as though in pain. Andreas glared at them triumphantly and drew a breath for the final verse. None could stand before true faith. The shadows rushed together, as though sucked into a vacuum. The writhing darkness formed into a definable shape, like a figure slowly emerging from a thick swirl of dark fog. Andreas's words turned bitter in his mouth as the last strands hardened into a gleaming, dark battleplate. A being stood in the center of the chorustorium, woven from the murderous darkness. It was at least 7 feet tall, bedecked in power armor, and a great horned helm. It held a long scythe in one spiked gauntlet, wreathed in an eerie blue luminescence. Worst of all was what covered the thing's armor plates. Flayed skins, many of them cracked with age, all sewn together and pinned in place with black iron spikes. Andreas could see shriveled arms, legs, and torsos, and gaping, wide-eyed face flesh, hung like grotesque masks across the thing's breastplate and pauldrons. The very air around the figure vibrated and crackled with dark energy. Andreas's cogitator screens had all shorted out. The nightmare warrior advanced towards the attendant master, its stride implacable. Andreas stumbled back, tripping on the hem of his green robes.
Please!
He stammered, desperately seeking something, anything that would halt the flesh-draped monster.
Please! No!
With a contemptuous swipe, the flayed giant sent the lectern between them crashing across the chamber. Shorn power coils sparked and snapped. Andreas pulled himself up onto his knees, weeping and shaking. The giant bent over him, his shadow obscuring the last light of the remaining lumen orb. It reached out with its free hand, slowly caressing Andreas's brow. The attendant master flinched as the thorns studding the nightmare's gauntlet tugged at his flesh. It spoke.
You are alone now, old man. Are you afraid?
Andreas whimpered. A damp patch was spreading through his lower robes. The nightmare's grip tightened fractionally.
You needn't be. If you had managed to get a warning away before I butchered your blind slaves, I may have taken revenge on you. As it is, I don't have the time to flay you. You'll die quickly. You should thank me for that.
Andreas moaned. The nightmare clamped its hand over his head.
Thank me,
it ordered.
Thank you?
Andreas managed to stammer.
Ave Dominus Nox,
intoned the nightmare. It crushed his skull. 2 hours to warp jump. Company Master Shah allowed the retinal scanner of the cryochamber to take its reading, remaining still and unblinking. There was a chime as it cleared him for entry. Disengaging locks clanged, followed by a click, click, click as the heavy blast doors, stamped with the Carcharodon's oceanic predator crest, rolled backwards. The lighting beyond was even murkier than elsewhere on board the White Moor. It barely reached the vaulted stone ceiling of the cryochamber and gleamed weakly from the brass ribs that encased the upright tanks lining the walls. As Shah entered, there was a whirring noise. A dozen hardwired combat servitors, spread across the wide room, turned to track him with their weapons. The company master ignored them, and after a moment, they jerked back to their original stances like freakish marionettes, their threat assessment scans complete. The robed attendants scurrying through the chamber's shadows bowed. The room was silent bar the throb of the energy coils snaking across the deck underfoot. Around Shah, his brothers slumbered. There were 40 in all, half of his company, secreted in the forecastle of the strike cruiser's armor-plated prow. They slept in individual tanks, their bare, pale bodies hooked up to vitae monitors and nutrient feeds and suspended in clear preservation fluids. Their lower faces were muzzled with respirator masks. It was how most of the chapter's battle brothers spent a great deal of their time in void space. Existing in the lifeless dark beyond the stars was no easy thing. The Carcharodon Astra had been roaming it for 10 millennia, cut off from all contact with the wider Imperium. The normal avenues for recuperation and replenishment utilized by the Space Marine chapters were rarely open to them. The suspended hibernation afforded by the cryotanks provided the chapter with a method of rest between combat operations and training cycles and helped preserve their strength. Typically, it was the younger brethren and initiates who utilized the tanks the most, overcoming deep void sickness through the meditational activities of their newly implanted Sasan membrane. Older Carcharodons, like Shah, tended to find it increasingly difficult to rest, even through the longer voyages. It was said Teika Harangi hadn't used his tank for many centuries. Shah could believe it. The end of the chamber was dominated by 5 larger tanks. Unlike the other Carcharodons, their occupants were fully clad in their warplate. Even inactive, they were an imposing sight. 5 Terminators of the Red Brethren, warriors of Lord Tyberos's own first company. The central tank contained the commander of the detachment. His name was Kahu. Like the other Terminators, his helmet was maglocked to his belt, and his lower face muzzled by a respirator cowl. His pale features were a complex network of ritual exile scars, the markings of a truly bloodied warrior. A leather cord, hung with the vicious incisors of half a dozen different predators, was lashed round his gorget. Even dormant, he exuded raw, savage threat. Shah had served alongside Kahu before. He knew the warrior's reputation was well-founded. In battle, his violence was implacable, ceasing only when the enemy had been utterly annihilated. He embodied the chapter's savage relentlessness. He was one of Lord Tyberos's enforcers, assigned to the roaming battle companies to ensure they followed the overall directives of the chapter and the nomad predation fleet. There was no doubt in Shah's mind. Kahu was with the company not to supplement its fighting power or provide tactical advice. He was present to ensure the Red Tide was carried out in full. He was the eyes and ears of Lord Tyberos, and his orders would be to allow nothing to interfere with the operation's primary objective. Most of the Red Brethren, Kahu included, had been serving the chapter longer than Shah. The knowledge did not make his new appointment as company master and Reaper Prime any easier to bear. He watched Kahu slumbering for a while, wondering what bloody imaginings were soothing his torpid thoughts. Eventually, he signaled to the surf attendants that waited on his orders.
"Wake them,"
he said to them, glancing around the chamber at the rest of the demi-company.
"All of them."
They started with the Red Brethren. Preset cogitator programs worked dashes of discord into the hibernating minds of the veteran Carcharodons, teasing their deep, drifting thoughts up towards surface consciousness. The temperature of the amniotic-like fluid in the tanks was raised. A pulse began to send increasingly violent tremors through each tank's framework. Valves in the deck beneath slid open, draining the preservation fluids. The levels lowered slowly as Shah watched, eventually reaching the upper back plating of the Terminators, and then their scarred scalps. As it was reduced down towards their skull and lightning-engraved breastplates, Kahu's eyes snapped open. They were equal parts black and pitiless. Shah met them without flinching. His own gaze, he knew, was no different. Slowly, the Terminator brought his hand up and broke the seal on his respirator mask, pulling it away from his tattooed face. Its removal revealed a vicious, grinning maw, full of razor-sharp teeth. Shah did not return the mirthless expression. The last of the liquid gargled down the drainage valve. A light set into scrimshawed skull tokens above the tanks winked green. There was a hiss as the thick crystal-flexed plates slid back into the recesses of their brass-ribbed flanks. The Red Brethren stepped out as one, and the deck shuddered.
"Kia ora, Void Brother,"
Kahu said in his serpentine, dead voice, pressing his skull close to Shah's in ritual greeting. Well met. Shah returned the gesture, stomaching his discomfort at Kahu's baleful presence.
"Kia ora,"
he replied.
"It is time for our final preparations, brother. We're 2 hours away from system re-entry. Teika Harangi believes the traitors may have already struck. They will need to be destroyed before the tithing can begin."
Kahu's vicious grin didn't falter.
"A truly red tithe, then, Brother Shah. Welcome home."
"The venerable chief librarian believes his visions are being realized,"
Shah added, ignoring the jibe. Around him, the other members of the slumbering company were waking, stepping out from their tanks to be robed by the attendants. Many of them, especially the younger ones, moved sluggishly, tense with cryo-cramps and the stomach-churning weakness that came with prolonged void sickness. Soon, their pale, dripping, scarred flesh would be death-plated and red-scarred, and the haunting dreams of half-sleep's depths would be forgotten amidst the thunder of battle.
"Old Teika Harangi and his visions," Kahu said dismissively. "Nothing can be allowed to impede the tithing. I do not need to remind you of your new duties as Reaper Prime, nor of the importance of the tithe to the future of the chapter."
Shah sensed the black eyes of many of his brothers on Kahu and the Red Brethren. They were outsiders, what the chapter called not of the Shiva, their brutal presence disrupting the natural currents that ran beneath the surface of the Third Company. Shah held Kahu's unsettling gaze.
"You do not need to remind me. Teika Harangi's mission will not interfere. The chapter will be replenished with the meat of this world."
Kahu nodded, his heavy gauntlet smacking Shah on the shoulder.
"I am looking forward to this one, brother. My void dreams have spoken of a great and glorious bloodletting. It has been too long since we faced a worthy foe."
"I would not call these traitors scum worthy,"
Shah said, turning away from the Terminator.
"And besides, you said it yourself, nothing must be allowed to interfere with the tithe."
The shock squad filed onto the bridge of the Imperial Truth, twitching for targets. It was clear they were too late. Nothing lived on the command deck, and the butchery didn't look like the work of escaped convicts. "Primary, we have a situation," Macran said into her vox. There was still no response from the precinct fortress. The boarding team spread out, shields and shotguns up, probing the shadows. And the bodies. There were plenty of those, and none of them fully intact. Whoever had killed the bridge crew, they'd been in bloody, slaughterous mood. Even a sub-warden with as little experience as Rannick knew the vicious markings of tearing, decapitation, and disembowelment could not have been the work of penal escapees. Something far stronger and even more violent had done this. Nor were the bodies fresh. The bridge stank of decay. They looked at least a week old, their pale skin tainted, the blood dark and crusted. "Focus, arbitrators," Macran snapped over the link. "I want this place locked down and secured." The squad split into fire teams and began to explore the bridge's inactive cogitator pews, oculus stands, command dais, and auger arrays. Rannick, outside of the squad's usual structure, found herself without a partner. She headed towards the only section not being immediately probed by the arbitrator teams, the primary communications pit at the foot of the command dais. She dropped down among the banks of machinery, boots crunching on the crusted decking plates. She realized immediately that something was wrong. The remains of the bridge's Vox staff lay butchered and rotting in the bottom of the pit. The actual Vox systems themselves, though, were still whirring. Activation lights winked, and the faint crackle of static hissed from hooked-up receiver grills and mic headsets. But that was not the worst thing about the pit. The worst thing was the body pinned to the primary transmission hub. Rannick approached slowly, shotgun aimed. There was a terrible, sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. Something was nightmarishly wrong. The body had been spread-eagled across the Vox hub, its head bowed, pinned in place with black nails that bore scraps of parchment Rannick didn't want to look at. For some unfathomable reason, cables had been torn directly from the hub's circuitry and surgically grafted into the corpse's larynx and thorax, and a transmitter node was rammed into its mouth. The body was still half-clad in the tattered remains of a Navy captain's uniform. Rannick realized she was probably looking at Van Hoyt, the very officer who had been addressing them barely an hour before via the Vox on Zartak. She stopped in front of the defiled corpse, trying to fathom how such a thing could be possible. Van Hoyt's head snapped up. His eyes were open, raw and wide with pain. He was still alive. He screamed. The sound tore through the Vox, a distorted shriek that made everyone on the bridge flinch. Rannick fired. It was a reflex action, born from panic. Van Hoyt's head vanished in a mist of blood and bone. The blasted ends of the wiring that had been inserted into his flesh snapped free. "Report!" shouted Macran. "What in the God Emperor's name was that?" "No contact," Rannick said. She was amazed to hear that her voice sounded so utterly calm. Her whole body was shaking, and she still had the shotgun leveled at Van Hoyt's twitching, headless corpse. "Repeat. No contact." "Then what in the name of the Emperor did you just shoot?" "The captain, I think." There was a thud as Macran dropped down into the pit next to Rannick. She forcefully lowered the Vox Legi and pushed herself into her field of vision. "What happened to him?" she demanded, gesturing at the defiled corpse. "There was something wrong," Rannick said. "I can feel it. I know you can too. No word from Zartak, from the other boarding teams. No survivors. Not even any Savlar. We need to get out of here." Macran didn't get a chance to reply. From the shadows of the bridge's rafters, clawed death dropped, chain blades shrieking. The arbitrators were caught spread out, half-deafened and disorientated by the sudden cacophony of long-dead victims. The howling giants showed no mercy. In a matter of seconds, the shock squad's corpses were joining those of the bridge crew. One of the towering monsters fell directly down into the communications pit behind Macran. She turned, shotgun coming up, but the nightmare swiped the weapon aside with the flat of its chainsword. It snatched her by the gorget with its other hand and slammed her into the side of the nearest Vox set. Rannick's shotgun was up, her body moving on panic-fueled instinct, but her finger hesitated on the trigger. If she fired, she hit them both. "Rannick!" Macran snarled, managing to make eye contact. Then the monster hit her. Its gauntlet punched through her skull, pulping it against the Vox and denting the metal beneath. The master-at-arms slumped, leaving a halo of blood where her head had been. The monster turned to Rannick, red lenses gleaming wickedly from its fanged skull helm. It loomed well over a foot above her, its armored form filling the space between the voxbanks. Something in Rannick's head told her to cower. It told her to drop her weapon and go down on her face amidst the stale blood and rotten flesh, and beg this nightmare from the shadows for mercy. It told her to do anything she could to stop it from tearing apart her body and claiming her soul. Instead, she screamed and opened fire. The first blast of the heavy shotgun struck it square in the breastplate. It rocked slightly. Rannick racked the slide and fired again. The monster spread both arms, as much as the pit would allow, intentionally exposing itself. She emptied 7 shells into it. The Vox Legi clicked, its ammunition drum empty. The nightmare was still standing, arms wide. Its breastplate was buckled, pitted and smoking, and dark blood oozed from the cracks. It laughed. Rannick dropped the shotgun. A part of her mind, still obeying the instincts drilled into her by her Progenium upbringing, told her to reach for her auto-pistol. She was too slow. With a speed that belied its bulk, the monster cracked the skull pommel of its chainsword into Rannick's helmet. She was dimly aware of hitting the deck, falling into the embrace of old, cold corpses. Her vision swam. She could see Macran's body, slumped against a voxbank, a fist closed around the edge of her breastplate, dragging her back up. Another tore her broken helmet from her head. She felt her legs kicking air. Her eyes were level with the nightmares. Their soulless red glare burned into her.
You will do,
rasped the monster. Her vision went blank, and she knew no more. Vorfax hefted the body of the Imperial over his shoulder and turned towards the bridge doors. The flayed father will want more than just one, Curthin remonstrated, as the raptor bent to wipe gore from his chainblade. This isn't for old Shadraith, Vorfax said. Khal wants one alive. He needs a survivor down on the surface. Someone who knows what happened. When help arrives for them, we need the reinforcements to go where we want. The urge to kill the scrawny Imperial was almost overwhelming. Unlike the rest of the humans, this one had done damage. Of course, Vorfax had let the human empty its shotgun into him, more to prove his own strength in front of the rest of the Claw than anything else. The price of his arrogance amounted to a badly scarred breastplate and 3 minor penetration wounds. He dismissed the damage icons on his visor display. The injuries had already clotted. He stamped through the slaughtered remains of the boarding team and left the bridge, taking a grav lift down to the shuttle bays. The Imperial Truth was in complete darkness now, its shadows echoing with distant screaming. The crew and the boarding parties were all dead, as were most of the thousands of convicts crammed into the prison holds. The ritual slaughterings of the past week had thinned the barrier between reality and the warp on board the vessel, and allowed the demons of Shadraith's patron, Bargul, to manifest. Their presence disgusted Vorfax, but the fickle creatures of the Empyrean had their uses. Without Shadraith's warp magic, it would have been impossible for the Night Lords to imitate the captain's voice and lure a detachment of the Imperials away from their planet-side fortress. They would need such talents again before the end. Khal was clever. Vorfax would give him that much. Clever, and good with his blade. It wouldn't help him, though. He was too ambitious and too arrogant, even by the standards of the Eighth. A warrior his age had no right leading a warband in the Long War. Unlike the less patient Claw champions, Vorfax had been pondering Khal's downfall for some time. He'd found an ally in the Terminator champion Shenzar. The harvest would offer them the perfect opportunity to seize control. All it needed was careful timing. Vorfax carried the unconscious human down the shuttle bay. There the ship's salvation pods still remained, intact. He strapped the Imperial into one, ignoring the moans as consciousness returned. The deck underfoot shuddered. Vorfax suspected it was the Imperial Truth's starboard battery, opening fire on the Imperial Navy cutter that had brought the boarding parties into orbit. Down on the surface, he knew that even now his brothers would be butchering the disorientated, scattered remnants of Zartak's pathetic garrison. The time for concealment and subterfuge was over, and the games would soon be starting. The stalk, the terror, the kill. Vorfax was eager to join them. The future of the warband hung in the balance. He punched the directional coordinates given to him by Khal into the salvation pod's inner control bank, locked and sealed the hatch, and began its external launch protocols. Then, without another glance, he headed back to the bridge. If the bold little Imperial survived re-entry, they would meet again. The thought dulled the already distant ache of Vorfax's wounds, and caused a smile to tug at his pale lips. Then, the games really would begin. Gene scan complete. Access granted. Beginning Manbank entry log. Date check. 3633875.M41. Day 75. Warp time variance approximate. Gideos is dead. I wasn't there when it happened. Warren was. He was covered in brains when I arrived in the scrying chamber. That was all that was left of poor Gideos after he heard the mortis cry. God Emperor only knows what happened to the rest of him. Something terrible is occurring on Zartak. The astropath attached to the Saint Angelica swears by it. He seems to be a venerable psyker of some experience, yet even he was half...